Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm at the Center for American Progress, and with me again today is James Joyner, the managing editor at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, James.
Hey, morning, Matt. How are you?
Very well. A lot of really interesting things being said about your place of employment, the Atlantic Council, over the last several weeks.
Yes.
Because of the fact that the Secretary of Defense nominee, Chuck Hagel, is on your board of directors. That's correct?
He's the chairman of our board of directors, indeed. Yeah.
Right. Yes, chairman of your board of directors, and it's so hard to keep track of all the various ridiculous charges that are being thrown against Hagel in this desperate effort to prevent his becoming the Secretary of Defense.
Right.
But one of them is this idea that there is somehow something very suspect about the Atlantic Council because of connections you have to shadowy Middle East figures.
Yeah.
In this case, Saad Hariri, the Lebanese politician. Which is interesting because, as people noted, yes, I think it was Michael Cohen yesterday who tweeted out various pictures of George W. Bush meeting with Saad Hariri.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And even more strangely, we actually don't have any ties to Saad Hariri at all. Our ties are with Baha Hariri, his older brother, who is not a politician, who is a businessman, and is the primary funder of our Middle East Center, which we've hidden the funding by calling it the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East.
In memoriam of Rafiq Hariri, who was, of course, assassinated by allegedly, but mostly by the Syrians.
Yeah, most likely by Hezbollah, is my understanding, and which makes it sort of. It makes the charge that the Hariris are somehow friends of radical Muslim extremists a very puzzling charge.
Right.
So yeah. But
and then Tim Murphy at Mother Jones put up a very interesting piece yesterday, a really important expose that showed all the people who, by virtue of their association and affiliation with the Atlantic Council, can now be counted as friends of terrorism. The list is very long.
Right.
It includes Condoleezza Rice, among others. And interestingly, it also includes James Woolsey, who, as Adam Serwer noted, co-authored a report on the threat of Sharia with Frank Gaffney, which now, of course, means that Frank Gaffney is affiliated with terrorism.
Well,
we have this rock solid. So, I mean, it's really how deep does this go is the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the strange thing, right? I mean, the Atlantic Council is, pretty far from a shadowy organization. We've been around 51 years now. We were founded by two former secretaries of state at the behest of a sitting secretary of state to basically to sort of manage what were a series of disparate groups sort of all lobbying for the transatlantic relationship for NATO and so forth, and we sort of got together and created a single Atlantic Council to sort of be the voice of that. And we've become something else over time as the Cold War ended, and especially the last few years under Fred Kemp, we've become a much more broad sort of organization of that. We're a think tank / policy shop, but very much bipartisan. And as the Mother Jones piece points out, and we've got everybody. We've got Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft and Woolsey and as the sort of the closer of the piece points out that the people who are lobbying against Chuck Hagel, their go-to person is Michelle Flournoy, who is also on our board.
Right.
So it's that sort of organization. It's people who we're an organization who is chaired by Chuck Hagel, and we gave a Freedom Award a couple of years ago to John McCain, who does not like Chuck Hagel very much, and they've had pretty public bitter falling out over Iraq. But on the and while I've got some differences with McCain on a lot of issues, on the transatlantic relationship, on freedom and those sort of things, we're all on the same side.
Right.
So there's differences in approach to how to get there, but
I think everything you just said, I think it's fairly well known. In the foreign policy community, the work the Atlantic Council does, how it really does strive to be a bipartisan organization. And works to cultivate a consensus around some of these issues and does very valuable work. I've attended a number of events there, some with you. I've really appreciated the Atlantic Council's work over the years. But I mean, going back to these attacks, I mean, the question I always have to ask, and this is a question I ask about neoconservatism in general,
Right.
But specifically in regard to these attacks that they keep launching against Hegel, are they really this stupid, or do they just think that their audience is this stupid?
I think it's both, and they're probably right in both cases, right? I mean, the problem is that, you know, while the Atlanta Council is pretty well known in town, I think it's gotten much better known in town the last 4 or 5 years as we've grown and become more important and, you know, doing more work. Yeah, we're not a household name. We're not even known in the way that Brookings is known. But frankly, people, you know, in the media, especially the conservative media, you know, Brookings is like some radical left-wing organization, right? And you know, whereas, you know, of course, you know, the Heritage Foundation is centrist and you know, nonpartisan. It's a strange deal. But the problem is that you know, I've had a lot of back and forth with my boss on this, Fred Kemp, who is our president and CEO, was a former associate publisher of the Wall Street Journal, ran Wall Street Journal Europe for a number of years, and his instinct with the Jennifer Rubins and the BuzzFeeds and all these people out there is to let's call them, let's talk to them. They're journalists after all, and they're after the truth. And I'm like, no, that's not the world we live in anymore. These these people are essentially in the opposition research business, and they're throwing charges out there. And I mean, my guess is that that Jennifer Rubin has no clue what the Atlanta Council is, and probably doesn't understand any of this stuff. But I don't think she cares. I don't think being set straight matters as long as is there charges to be made and you can find the facts that sort of fit your case, and the rest of them are sort of irrelevant and unuseful to you. So it's
right. No, I think that's no. I mean, I think that's a very fair take, and I mean, and you're totally correct. I mean, this is what it is. It's just, and it's not just Oppo research; it's bad Oppo research.
Well, yeah, that's right.
Really offends me.
Well, yeah, because the problem is that there's no, I mean, there have been some pieces. There were a couple pieces, related to this stuff. They're much more fairly written, but are still fundamentally wrong in the New Republic, an organization, a magazine I respect. I was a subscriber to it for years, a long time ago, and have largely quit subscribing to those sort of magazines just because I don't have time to read them, and there are other ways to get the information. And I've written for the New Republic, and fairly, in the last few months, I've written a couple pieces on drones and published it there. But they've had some pieces on the think tank business and including the Atlanta Council thing. They're just basically their facts are hazy, and their analysis of the facts are just wrong. They just don't understand how the business works, and don't seem to much care. And strangely, they're written up by 22-year-old junior research assistants and junior editors, whatever they call them, but by Harvard ethics professors who have a column there and are convinced that the whole think tank world is corrupt because after all there are people giving them money and they're rating stuff that people are asking them to rate. And a part of the problem too is the conflation of they're the think tanks, sort of the pure old school think tanks, the Brookings and the CSISs who are basically Rand, who are basically universities without students, right? And then there are, organizations, like the Atlanta Council, like a lot of others that are, that have something of a public policy agenda. There's some, driving influence beyond, you're not simply hiring smart people to do work. You've got some basic coherent message, although ours is pretty broad and bland in the sense that, it's, given the sort of the wide, scope of people we attract, it's a pretty, broad agenda. And then you've got, on the other hand, you've got, the very partisan, think tanks in name only, who are doing research, but not, but basically with a party interest and, party agenda in mind, and that's driving everything. And so much of these debates conflates those distinctions, and they're all the same thing because Heritage calls themselves a think tank or AEI calls themselves a think tank. They're the same as Brookings and CSIS. It should be, be viewed the same way. And I don't think that's right. I think they're just different sorts of organizations. That doesn't mean that they don't do good. I mean, there's good stuff that comes out of Heritage and AEI, but good stuff isn't their primary driving agenda.
Right. I mean, I think, speaking for my organization, which often gets accused of that, clearly we're a progressive organization. Our cards are on the table with regard to our political ideology. And I think that's really the key thing, is just being upfront and transparent about what you're trying to do with regard to, the same with AEIs. Like it really comes down to the work. Like I disagree with AEI's general ideology and their general approach to the world, but I mean that in and of itself is not enough to discredit any particular piece of work that comes out of AEI at the end of the day. And I know that's not what you're saying.
Oh no! I mean, Cato's.
But I think you are correct. I think it is correct to kind of try and distinguish some of these different organizations and their different approaches. Yeah. All of which would tend to fall under the heading of think tank as we might call it. Yeah. But it is really interesting to see that the Atlantic, while doing while doing both policy and some advocacy work, while trying to maintain a centrist bipartisan a position as a bipartisan organization in an environment where you do have more organizations, including mine. Being more forthright about approaching things from a particular political orientation.
You're right. No, I think that's right. And frankly, to some degree, I found that sort of being sort of a moderate right to center right blogger, that you're almost in a situation where you've got no allies because if you're not on somebody's team, you're sort of off the team in the current sort of mindset. So it's.
No, I think that's a good segue into, I wanted to, I think we touched on this the last time we did a Blogging Heads together, where you have, Hagel as the representative or a voice or an avatar of this kind of Republican realism that no longer seems to be reproducing itself in the Republican Party. You can point to people like Scowcroft and others who have these ideas. People like Steve Clemens, also who's very active around this stuff. But in terms of younger up and coming, you have younger writers. You have there's Justin Logan at Cato who are doing great work around this stuff. But in terms of politicians who are going to bear these ideas forward, they're very rare. I can't think of very many. But then that brings us to Rand Paul. Right, and his speech at the Heritage a few weeks ago. What was your take on that speech?
It's odd. I think Rand Paul's a little odd, and he's not. The problem is that he's not a foreign policy guy. So, he takes his father's sort of, basically what we sort of call a paleocon view now. Although I don't know if that's really fair. It's really more isolationism and just a view that America really doesn't have a role that requires a large military. And just basically that everything isn't our business. And while I subscribe to parts of that, I think I do. I don't think there's a way for that. It benefits us to pull back to the extent that that Rand and Ron and the other Paulites would like. And I don't think there's much constituency for that. But it's at least that's a more easily articulated view than the realist view, which is you pick what's in your national interest and and what's achievable within the means you're willing to pay and all that. That's a complicated elevator speech, and it doesn't excite anybody, right? So it's I don't know how it got this far this fast. As we talked about last time, George W. Bush ran in 2000 on no nation building, a humble foreign policy. Condoleezza Rice wrote a really strong piece in Foreign Affairs, during the campaign that was basically, sort of his white paper. And
that Hagel, that could have come out of Chuck Hagel's mouth.
It did. In fact, I wrote a piece, I guess, for the Atlantic, a month or so ago, maybe a little bit, maybe a little while longer than that. I guess it came out shortly after the election, and basically pointing to a piece that Chuck Hagel wrote that was like widely vilified. Once the nominations came forward, that how just out of touch this was, and so much of it could have been lifted from that Connie Rice piece,
Right.
But this is Chuck Hagel writing in like 2004, 2005,
Right.
and it's amazing how far. But what happened is the Iraq War just changed everything, I think, and it changed the mindset that the interventionist wing. I mean, the debate sort
or
of
9/11. I mean, wouldn't you say 9/11 was?
Well, sure, 9/11 changed things, but I mean, there was consensus. There's a bipartisan consensus after 9/11 that we had to do something to we had to go after terrorism. Sort of hammer and tong at the war on terrorism.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying.
But Iraq became the polarizing thing, right? That the consensus got shattered with Iraq, and even once it became pretty clear to me, who ultimately, like Chuck Hagel, I opposed. I was sort of anti-John Kerry, right? I opposed it before I was for it, and and then came to see him. It didn't take too long to realize, okay, so the rationale that we went in for turned out to be disproven. And I think you can, I don't think you have to sort of pretend that, well, we did find some mustard gas, and so therefore he had weapons of mass destruction. That's clearly not what we went in for. And then the sort of the cost of doing business, and it was pretty obvious that the war was a failure. Certainly by 2005, if not earlier than that. But it became heresy to sort of admit that and state that publicly and advocate for pulling out, because then you weren't for victory, and you weren't for democracy, and you weren't for freedom, or whatever the heck. And it became it's how sort of Chuck Hagel and John McCain went from being bosom buddies to sort of sort of rivals, and Hagel sort of pretty much run out of the party. And basically, those of us who, were either like, Brent Scowcroft, who was right all along in Iraq, or like Chuck Hagel and myself, who were eventually right in Iraq, became marginalized because, we were playing for the wrong team at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder how much of it, I mean, it seems that, there's the argument about Iraq, which McCain is obsessive about. But even McCain himself confessed last week that it's not so much substantively about Iraq; it's just the fact that he went off team. He would criticize his own side. So it seems just like I guess it's stating the obviously, but it's an enormously petty and inappropriate reason to hold up a secretary.
No, it's bizarre, but I mean, sort of having worked around the business, although never in it. I mean, politics is just, it's so personal, and it's and especially if you're at the level of a McCain and you put yourself out there, and what you've got to do, to run for president, let alone as the nominee, what you've got to endure for all that time, and then to be rejected by somebody in favor of somebody you think is unworthy, I mean, McCain. Right. And I voted for McCain, although sort of reluctantly after the Palin nomination, because it didn't bode well for his judgment. But I think McCain really went sort of off the rails after that, and he sort of whereas John Kerry, who lost the election, went and licked his wounds, and it really elevated himself. I think much more of Kerry now than I did, when he was running in 2004. I think, and McCain sort of went the other way. He sort of became this cranky old guy who was sort of angry at the world.
Well, I think it's also that McCain understood that was it.
Yeah.
He's going to finish out his time in the Senate, and that's pretty much it. Whereas Kerry clearly understood that he could kind of bide his time and do what he's doing now, which is being Secretary of State.
Yeah, but you can always be, you can be a Brent Scowcroft type, right? You can basically,
good point.
You can be, or I mean, we've got people, in both parties, the Henry Kissingers and the Zbigniew Brzezinskis, and that are, elder statesmen, and well into their 80s. And McCain could have certainly done that. I mean, I think even, Barack Obama had, great respect for him as a foreign policy, national security guy. And I think that's gone. I think a lot of people just sort of view him as a crank at this point, and I think that's unfortunate.
I wish that were true.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, something tells me that no matter how cranky and off the rails John McCain gets, he'll still be invited to Bill Kristol's conferences to be a voice of reason. And
well,
and
sure, but
whatever.
it's one thing. But although it's his little town hall meeting, yesterday or the day before, whenever it was, or demonstrated, he's gone off from being the John McCain that he was, certainly the John McCain he was in 2000. The maverick that he was. But he's, as far right as he's gone and as vitriolic as he's become, he's still not necessarily beloved even within conservative circles.
Right.
So he's in this weird world.
Yeah, there was this thought in today's Washington Post style section. There was, on the front section of that was, who is John McCain? Who's the real John McCain?
Yeah.
And I saw that and said, that question was semi-reasonable in 2008.
Yes.
It is no longer a reasonable question. I think we have a pretty good idea of who John McCain is at this time.
Yeah.
Or by this time.
Yeah.
So again, it just speaks to this is one of those narratives that won't die.
Right.
This idea that John McCain, he's so complicated, and sure, people are complicated, but I think over the past 4 years, I think the Palin pick pretty much showed us that whatever John McCain might say about leadership and country first and everything, at the end of the day, he was really willing to put America at risk for the possibility of winning.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. It's it's become that at that point it was just all in and sort of whatever it took. And yeah, it's a bizarre situation to be in, and again, it's unfortunate. I mean, even by 2008, he'd been in public service, going back to his time at the Naval Academy for literally a half a century, and had a pretty good reputation, I think, across the board. I mean, he still gets invited to the Sunday shows, I guess. So there's that.
Right. That's his key constituency, I think.
Well, they're his age, so I guess but it's sad, but it is what it is, and at some point, I think the mystery is gone. I don't know, whether this is who he's always been, is debatable, but it's certainly who he's been the last 5 or 6 years, and that's probably good enough as an operating principle.
So getting back to Rand Paul for a moment, I thought one of the things that was interesting about Paul's speech was the extent to which he was, it focused on Reagan, and it was an attempt to take Reagan back from the neoconservatives, I think. And one of the, if you go back to kind of one of the founding documents of modern foreign policy neoconservatism is the 1996 Foreign Affairs essay by Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan toward a neo-Reaganite foreign policy. Yeah. In which they use Reagan as an inspiration, his opposition to the Soviet Union, his anti-communism, peace through strength, his very vocal support for freedom. Right. Now, I mean, it's clear they have a very selective reading of Ronald Reagan, and I think they kind of tip their hand at one point when they dismiss the city on a hill metaphor, which is one that Reagan loved. Right. But the whole point of a city on a hill is that the city on a hill is an example to other cities. It does not go about invading and transforming those cities. That's right. You just sit there on a hill and you look good. That's right. Right. And others look to your example and they see how you operate and they see how your democracy works and they take inspiration from that. So they had to dismiss that aspect of Reagan's worldview in order to put forward their much more aggressive and militaristic one. Right. But I did think it was interesting how Rand Paul, he was trying to give a different interpretation of Reagan, one that was, again, much more like 2000 election campaign George W. Bush, a much more humble one, a much more realistic one, a much less expensive one. Right. So I do wonder how much, and granted, there's always been this contestation of Reagan's legacy and what Reagan really meant and what he really means. But I wonder if that's going to become more pronounced as these tensions on foreign policy continue. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it sort of baffles me. And I say that as somebody who sort of came of political age, during the Iran hostage crisis in the 1980 election. Oh my God, that's been a long time. I mean,
that's 32 years ago now. And I sort of play. I mean, I wrote a piece for the National Interest a few weeks back. Sort of likening what Obama is doing with the so-called leading from behind. Arguing that in a way it sort of picks up the Reagan doctrine. Fighting through proxies and
right.
If other people are willing to take the fight, we'll throw some a little bit of material support and that we actually don't want to do the heavy lifting. But the analogy only works a little bit because, I mean, the Cold War's over. It's a whole world system that's gone and will, it's like never come back. Mm-hmm. And, to sort of understand Reagan, I don't think you can understand Reagan outside of that context. His foreign policy was solely about, anti-communism. And absent that, I mean, I don't know what Reagan's foreign policy would be now. I mean, presumably he'd be anti-jihadist terrorism. I don't know what if it, but it doesn't have a capital. It's a completely different thing. And Reagan's legacy is mixed, right? I mean, we've got the intervention in Lebanon, which got a bunch of Marines killed ultimately, in a peacekeeping mission that wasn't, followed by Grenada, which depending on your view, and I'm not sure that mine is that fixed even after all this time. Whether it was a diversion from Lebanon or it was a real thing. You've got the Contras and Nicaragua. You got the supporting the government in El Salvador. You've got a bunch of there's mixed interventionism in Reagan's time, but. On the other hand, it's not like we had any major ground wars under his tenure either. It was all very limited interventions and, a lot of military spending, deterrence, sort of all the various nuclear programs, that ultimately at least partially got dismantled with START II, Star Wars, all that stuff. So it wasn't a cheap foreign policy by any means.
Right.
But it certainly wasn't one that called for, long-term occupations of countries to turn them into democracies.
Yeah. So before we finish, I just want to talk for a minute, and this, definitely relates to the tensions within the conservative movement around foreign policy with Ted Cruz, who distinguished himself, and I don't think in a good way, in the Hagel hearings, both the hearings with Hagel and then the Senate Armed Services Committee conference, just coming out with some really, really horrible stuff, suggesting that Hagel may have taken money from, North Korea, as if North Korea's got money to dole out.
Right.
Saudi Arabia, just these really, and I don't think we should use the McCarthyite charge lightly, but it was very McCarthyite. And I think others have remarked on that.
Yeah.
But
when you
the question is,
rebukes from Lindsey Graham, for being over the top, it's
right. Yeah, when John McCain is really coming out as the voice of reason,
right.
Given his own performance, you're in some serious trouble.
Yes.
But the question is, okay, what does that really mean for Cruz? Who knows what's being said behind closed doors by other senators? But he in response to that performance, he got the Tea Party hat trick. He got scolded by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Politico.
Right.
And I mean, that's just a win-win for him. A,
really
he gets the visibility. B, he gets negative attention from the mainstream media.
Right.
And that's just his base will just gobble that up.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the problem is there are a whole lot of problems. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that, running in Texas, and granted, he doesn't have to run for a long time yet. But I think that if you're watching Fox News and listening to Rush Limbaugh, and that's your, take on the world,
right.
Yeah, all of that is probably good news. Was it a Politico piece? It was basically that everybody hates Ted Cruz. The Democrats and Republicans think he's just sort of a jerk. That he's stepping on everybody's toes. He's not doing his homework, and he's just being blustery and not doing what you're supposed to do as a junior senator. But that probably plays pretty well at home. Let's say, yeah, good for him.
All right. No, it flows like very, very well with the basic, with the basic Tea Party view that, that Washington is corrupt, and this
Right.
idea that you have to go there and actually study policy and learn what you're talking
Right.
about that's just a lot of BS.
Yep.
These issues are very simple, and now all we need is someone to go in there and throw elbows around and talk, and be willing to be bold and speak the truth.
Yep.
And that's all it takes. It's just this sense that governing is not very complicated. We just need someone to go in there and clean house.
Right.
And he seems to be playing to that what I think is a very flawed worldview very, very expertly.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I had not paid a lot of attention to him, prior to the Hagel hearings, to be honest with you. I was aware that he existed, but, because since it was a non-contested seat.
Yeah, it's a major success now. We're sitting here talking about it.
Well, that's right. But, I don't know how much of this is an actor or this is just who he is. My tendency is to given, without contrary information, is to assume this is who the guy is. He's just...
Right. Well, this gives me an opportunity to quote Kurt Vonnegut: "Be careful who you pretend to be, because in the end, that's who you are."
Right. Exactly.
So if any time I can end one of these with a Kurt Vonnegut quote, I need to jump on that opportunity.
Absolutely.
So, James, always great to talk to you.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, look forward to doing it again soon.
Terrific.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.